We're doing clinical research horror stories. I think you can make a whole podcast series around this. These are just some of mine. There's way worse where there's blatant fraud and abuse and all kinds of stuff. Like people go to jail. Luckily, I've never been close to any of that stuff, but you don't need to get close to any of that stuff to still have horror stories and to learn lessons. All right, Guru Nation, it's not Halloween, it's Valentine's Day, but we're doing spooky stuff today. We're doing clinical research horror stories, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, basically 5 stories to tell you. Not all are mine. I'm involved in most, and I'll tell you when I am and when I'm not. I'm involved in most either as a site, a monitor, or a friend of a colleague. So in those ones, it's not direct. And I'm obviously not going to reveal specifics because I don't know. I don't know how these things work as far as the NDAs are concerned. A lot of these are old. Like a lot of these being my mistakes were really a long time ago. So it's probably like fine now, but I'm still going to not give it details. But I'm going to start out with a relatively recent one. So imagine losing an entire study's data based on sites, and a lot of sites not completing the e-pros properly. So this was a terrible situation I was involved in where it required tracking patients when they go to sleep, and the patients had to document their dinner times because the IP needed them to take their meds with a meal. So that sounds like a lot, right? And the subjects were asked, the patients were asked to record every day their meal times, but specifically their dinner times, because they had to take it before they dosed their investigational product, which was a pill. So it sounds like it's not a big deal, and you plan this study and the CRO manages it, and the requirement is, and there's a bunch of other stuff that this study entailed, but this was the Achilles heel for this study. But hindsight's 2020. If something's that important, you should probably train the sites on that specific thing. And this is why I think teaching the sites why something is important versus just telling them everything they need to do is critical. So I was at this site initiation visit, and the sponsor actually came out, and she sat down with us, which typically doesn't happen. We were a rescue site. The sponsor came out, and the sponsor representative was a female, and she came out, and she told us, all these things we had to worry about. And it was a weight loss study. So the focus was not even on this diary necessarily. The focus was on keeping retention, keeping the patients engaged. It's a long-term study, et cetera, et cetera. They briefly mentioned the diary, and they said, yeah, there's no way around it, but we have to record meal times, especially dinner. We do ask for 80% compliance, and they should be tracking every meal. But really, the dinner one's the most important, and that was it. Well, it turns out, and this was daily, they wanted daily diaries from patients, and this was a study with like 90 sites. It turns out that when you give patients diaries, and this was all done on their cell phones, there was an app they had to download. The CRO made the app. Nobody was checking for compliance. Like, people were just looking at that 80%. Was that 80% compliance being tracked. Nobody paid attention to the times of dinner and the times of the IP dose in the evening. And that ended up killing the study, because even though we saw with our own eyes, and I talked to other sites doing the same study, we saw with our own eyes the drug worked. Patients lost weight. The sponsor had to completely redo the study because patients were either not putting what time they took dinner, they were just skipping it, or they were just doing it after the fact and putting like random times, but then putting the IP was taken before in many cases. In a lot of cases, those are all deviations. However, the sites never check the e-diaries. If you're a site, all you're doing really is you're checking if the patients are doing the e-diaries. You're not checking, especially if you don't know that something's necessarily important. Like, I go back, the SIV said, make sure they're 80% compliant and dinner is the most important. So what's a site going to do with that information? Well, when the patient comes in for their next visit, you look, did they do their diaries? And you kind of look and say, okay, yeah, they're 80% compliant. And if they're not, let's say they were 70, you document that you retrained them, that they're supposed to be compliant, et cetera, et cetera. And you don't look at times. You don't look at what time they put and what time they took their IP. Certain sites did, but they were the minority of the sites. And certain sites trained, what I actually think happened, our site, we got lucky, because here's what happened. We trained our patients very well. We read verbatim the instructions. And then we got lucky that the 12 patients that we enrolled basically followed the instructions. And they did it correctly. We had a few that were like, they did it incorrectly, but the majority were correct. So we actually came out looking pretty good. But this is a horror story. The sponsor could not use any of the data. Many of the sites that the sponsor chose were not given studies again. And this points back to who's in charge of the ePros and the eDiaries. Should it have been the sponsors looking at this? If that was that important, the sponsor should have looked. Apparently, the FDA wanted to see if the IP is taken after dinner, or with dinner, if it's absorbed properly and all that stuff. So they couldn't even use the data because patients were either just putting whatever times they wanted to get through the next page of the ePro. And then if sites would actually did their job, us included, we just got lucky, like I said. But if, let's say the sites actually were doing their job, they would tell the patient at the next visit, hey, remember, you're supposed to take the IP with dinner or shortly after. So what you're putting in the diary doesn't make sense because you're putting that you're taking the IP before. If that's an error, let us know. We could fix it. We need a data clarification form. We need to go through a whole process, but I'd rather re-educate you so that you can do it properly going forward. And so this is a horror story of everybody dropping the ball. Everybody screwing up. The sponsor screwed up for not emphasizing the importance of tracking those times and why it was important. Because if they would have told the sites, the FDA wants to see it this way, and stayed on top of us, and then stayed on top of the CRO and the CRA, who also dropped the ball, all of them, and the ePro vendor for not having alerts in there. Like, this is so many fail points here. So many things could have been implemented to catch this. And it was only caught at an interim data review, and the sponsor must have lost tens of millions of dollars. And a lot of sites lost their reputation. So that's a very recent horror story of like some data just being wasted, like a lost data nightmare. I have a particular horror story of a deviation gone wrong. I was a monitor on a site, and they were working on stem cells. And in this particular case, it was supposed to be the patient's own stem cell that was the ingredients to create the IP. So the sponsor would actually take tissue sample from the patient, make the investigational product, and send it back to the site to administer to the patient at their next visits. This site used the wrong patient's IP. Luckily, that patient did not experience any adverse events, but it could have gone horribly wrong. Thankfully, it didn't. I was the CRA on this. We had to clean this up. We had to audit the site too. We had to implement CAPA plans and all kinds of things. And it was a small oversight, but this is an example of a small oversight that can lead to disaster. And in this case, we avoided a disaster with the IP. There are other deviations that have gone wild. I was a coordinator. This one was my fault. I was a coordinator on a study. This was one of my first trials, 2006. We were doing an inpatient schizophrenia study, and nobody trained me on what I needed to do. And I was the weekend crew for the hospital. So we had our patient in the hospital unit, and the nurses were busy. I was supposed to give the IP for the weekend to the nurses. And the nurse told me to leave it. Now, the nurse was not part of our study. She was just in charge. PI delegated her to distribute the IP to the patients. And we only had one patient in the unit that weekend. The nurse told me that she was busy, but just put the medication in the patient's room and she'll go get it later, and to have a nice weekend, like I can go home. Well, I get a phone call a couple hours later from the PI, so I knew it was serious. And the PI asked me, "Did you give the IP to the nurse, or what happened?" So I explained what I did. And he said, and remember, this is a schizophrenia study. He said, "Oh man, everybody's freaking out because the patient took the entire blister pack that you left in the room." And that was a huge wake-up call for me. It was like my third or fourth month of working. This was 2005. And I was freaking out. And he said, luckily, we called the sponsor, we unblinded, and it was placebo. But it could have gone horribly wrong as well. Like, that could have been one of my first experiences in research, harming a patient. And so I learned from that horror story, because that was my own experience. And if you stay in this industry long enough, you're either going to experience directly, hopefully nothing that actually harms a patient. But that one was my fault. I should not have listened to that nurse because I knew she was not part of the study. But I kind of saw her as an authority figure because she was the hospital worker. I wasn't. I assumed she talked to the PI about what I was there for. She never did. It was our PI's fault for entrusting such a new person, me, to do something important. And he assumed that I understood the consequences when I clearly didn't. So that's a horror story as well. Another horror story, this time an ethical one, that I was involved with as an observer. So we had, back in Orange County, we have a lot of research sites and we have a lot of competitors doing psych studies. There's a lot of psychiatric population in Southern California, and not surprisingly, there's a lot of research sites doing psych studies there. And there's a lot of like patients that kind of hop around site to site and do trials. So we had an outpatient study, and this patient came in from an ad. And we went through the consent form, and he kept asking me, this is not an inpatient study, right? And I said, no, this is not. We're not doing an inpatient study. It's outpatient only. And I had to like reassure him of that. And I can tell he was very uneasy about it. And then I asked him to like explain why he's freaking out. He told me that in the last study he did with a competitor, which I'm not going to name them, they've been acquired since then, so it wouldn't even matter. But they were put in an inpatient study, and they were not allowed to leave when they wanted to. So it was like a 30-day study. Overnight, they had to stay in for 30 days. But as everyone knows watching, hopefully you know, a patient can quit at any time. And the patient wanted to leave. And the study staff told the patient he couldn't because he might be a risk to himself and others, because he was in that unit to titrate or wash off of his current antipsychotics in order for them to put him on the study antipsychotics. And he said he felt fine and just give him back his regular antipsychotics. He wanted to leave. Obviously, I wasn't there to assess whether he was actually paranoid, because a lot of people with schizophrenia do have paranoid delusions. But when the guy was in front of me doing a completely different outpatient study, he seemed fairly rational, and he just had this fear, this lingering fear from a bad experience he had, where they kept him against his will for 30 days. So that's a horror story where I was kind of an observer or indirectly involved. There's a horror story from, this one's one that's my fault. So IRB failure, again in my early days, I want to say around 2006, we had a study. It was incredibly hard to recruit for. And we had to go to the Parkinson. I had to figure out a way to get patients. It was a Parkinson study. And I had to figure out a way to get patients. I struck a relationship with the Parkinson's Association, our local chapter in the Inland Empire, which is Palm Springs, San Bernardino area. So I went out there. We got a bunch of referrals, but the flyers that I took them were not IRB approved. And they were nothing crazy. Like, it was nothing unethical written on the flyers. It was basically what the study is. But I was stupid enough to put the drug company's logo on the flyer. And little did I know that Parkinson's Association, as part of, like, they were doing a favor to me. They didn't want to get me in trouble. They were doing it as a favor. They put our flyer in their newsletter that they mailed out to the community. And turns out that the study director for the study lived in that community, and he subscribed to that newsletter because it was a therapeutic indication that was obviously important to him, being that this was his primary focus as the study director for this big pharmaceutical company. And this guy didn't like me. He didn't like our site. I feel like he could have handled it differently with me, because what I was doing was working. It was getting patients in. He should have just retrained me on, hey, great strategy. Let's teach sites in other regions how you did it. But this is what you did, where you went wrong. You should have got this formality of a flyer approved by the IRB, and you shouldn't have put our logo on it. Or you should have asked us to provide you with marketing materials. I mean, this was back in the day. Sponsors didn't really help you out too much with this. And again, no one really taught me that I have to get flyers IRB approved. I thought as long as I don't put the drug name in there, I'm good, and that putting the brand equity of the pharma company behind it is going to help me gain trust and credibility with the end user or the reader of this flyer. Well, this study director got pissed, called me the very next day after he found out, asked me if I got that flyer IRB approved. And I was scared. So I said, I don't know. I'd have to look into it. What happens if we didn't? And then he told me, if you don't, you're going to lose the study and we're never going to work with you again. And so that was the end of it. We lost the study. I think the study director didn't like us. In hindsight, there were some issues between him and our PI that I was unaware of, but they had worked together in the past, and I think he had it out for us. But it's a horror story because I shouldn't have put the drug company's logo on the flyer, and I really should have gotten it IRB approved, and I didn't. But in reality, it was an effective strategy, and it was not unethical language. The IRB would have approved it instantly, minus the logo. They would have told me to take the logo out. But to me, it was a horror story, and I learned the hard way, hey, you can't really do this, even if something works. Not a good idea to do that. So that's my IRB and recruitment. Then there's tons of sponsor site miscommunications, particularly around protocol amendments. So the protocol amendments, there was one particular study I was coordinator on, and the sponsor changed the protocol, but we implemented the new amendment before the actual protocol got approved. And we thought we were ahead of the curve, and this was, again, like back in the day. Now it's automatic. You don't do anything until you get that protocol amendment IRB approved. And we implemented the amendment without the IRB approval. And before you know it, we got put on a screening hold. We got told to do a CAPA plan where we thought we were actually doing something good. And in reality, we were basically committing protocol deviations at scale. Basically, every visit we did was another deviation. And I have tons more horror stories. This could be a 3-hour podcast. I get the added benefit of being with Chris Sauber, a consultant for a bunch of sites across the country. And we have tons of horror stories about site owners and their PIs, and how the PI and the site owner get into an argument, and then there's a debate about who owns the study, and is it the site that signed the contract, or is it the PI that has the oversight? Typically, the sponsors tend to side with the PI, but legally, it's the site if the site signed the CTA. And so we have tons of stories where sites are doing things and the PI doesn't even know, like not even aware that they're signing things in his name. We got this horror story call from a client about 4 years ago from the PI who was fed up with that site and wanted to go start his own site. And he basically told us what was going on. This was in Miami, of course. Miami has a reputation for these kind of things. And the site was basically doing the study without the PI's involvement and signing on behalf of the PI and all this stuff. And the PI wanted to know, hey, I still want to do studies, but I don't want to be associated with these people. How do I get out of this situation? And we told him, you got to talk to the sponsor, let them know that you're not actually doing this. Like, they're using your name. It was risky because he still wants to be a PI and it's going to be associated with his name regardless. So we told him to document all his conversations with the site, to let them know in documented email that it's not okay for them to sign on his behalf, that he's just been made aware of this and he's not okay with it. He managed to get himself out of it. He now has his own site, doing great. was able to put this behind him. I have a similar story, although I didn't do work on behalf of a PI, but I had a PI way back in the day who I got a study for as a site owner, and he managed to, behind my back, basically convince a coordinator of mine to, at the site selection visit, which I was not involved in, convince the sponsor to give him the study, but not at my site, at his other site that he had going on without my knowledge, 2 blocks down the road from my site. And so they did the site selection visit. I wasn't a part of it. I was very hands-off at that time too. And the SSV happened, the site selection visit happened, just like any of them. I didn't hear much for like a month. And then a month or so after, I get curious, like, hey, whatever happened to that site selection visit? Did we get selected? So I emailed the monitor, and the monitor said, yeah, we selected Dr. So-and-so, but it's under this company. And it was not my company. So I looked into it. I confronted the coordinator about it. She admitted that the PI basically convinced her to start another site with him. So this PI site owner relationship can go both ways. It's a two-way street. You need mutual trust. So I basically obviously got rid of that PI and that coordinator. I gave her the choice: you either work with me or you work with him, because she said he kind of forced her to do it. She chose to work with me. Later on, she went to medical school. She became a doctor, and she ended up still being a good coordinator for me afterwards. But she could have been fired for that too. But I kind of believed her that the PI was influencing her way too much to help him out. And that was my horror story as far as PI relationships. So there's horror stories. I think you can make a whole podcast series around this. And maybe we'll do one. Maybe we'll do like a 2-hour one for Halloween, where I'll get guests on and they'll share some of their horror stories. And we'll have like a 2 or 3 hour horror fest. But I just wanted to get this video / podcast for you guys, kind of like a true crime pod, but research style. And there's way worse. These are just some of mine. But I know there's way worse in the industries. I've actually done videos on some of them, where there's blatant fraud and abuse and all kinds of stuff. Like, people go to jail. Luckily, I've never been close to any of that stuff. But you don't need to get close to any of that stuff to still have horror stories and to learn lessons that you shouldn't make these kind of mistakes. So hopefully you can learn from this a little bit. Let me know your horror stories in the comments. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Bye-bye. Hey, if you guys like that kind of content, make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. Stay tuned for more videos.